Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Philosophical Society. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society. And I'm so thrilled to welcome all of you here tonight for the first start of a conversation about John Dickinson that begins tonight, is going to continue tomorrow. The American Philosophical Society is a co-sponsor of this event, along with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and I'd like to thank David Brigham for coming, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. And I saw Connie King in the audience, and I think Michael Barsanti may be watching us online. And I also want to welcome Bob Hauser, the Executive Officer of the Philosophical Society. This project promotes useful knowledge, which is, of course, what the American Philosophical Society does. Our title is the American Philosophical Society held in Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And what's particularly fitting for tonight is John Dickinson plays a role in the founding and creation of the Philosophical Society as we know it today. So not only does this project serve our mission by promoting useful knowledge, but John Dickinson was a member of the American Philosophical Society. But he was actually first elected a member of the American Society for Promoting Useful Knowledge. It's a little bit of an interesting story about APS history and Dickinson's career. The American Society for Promoting Useful Knowledge was created in Philadelphia in 1768 by what was seen by many in the older American Philosophical Society, which was founded in 1743, as a group of young upstarts who didn't pay attention to their elders. These young upstarts said these elders were a little too inactive and boring and not doing exciting work, and there needed to be another institution created. A year later, actually started in 1768, the conversations, the negotiations between these two organizations, they said it's silly to have two of these organizations. We should mend our fences and create an organization. And so in 1769, the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, was created in its modern form, and Dickinson was made a member of that as well. So it's particularly fitting that we're hosting this event tonight. And I have to say, there's also a personal element to this, which is that for a while, John Dickinson was a rival to me. My wife, or at the time not wife, one of her projects as a graduate student was to go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and process a cache of unprocessed Dickinson papers. And she was blown away by what she found and what she learned about a man who I think is often overlooked and underappreciated by Americans and by historians themselves. She uncovered a case. Rachel Francisco was accused of infanticide in Delaware, and John Dickinson took it on pro bono. And Laura Keenan Spiro, my wife, wrote an article on it to show the case, an aspect of Dickinson's legal career that was unknown, and published it in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. And what I think this story underscores is how much there is to be learned about John Dickinson and how much more there is to know about him. And it's this project that Jane Calvert and others have created, have built, and are now publishing volumes aims to fix, to make access to Dickinson, his writings, his thinkings more accessible. And so I'm honored now to introduce the force behind the John Papers project, Jane Calvert. If you don't know Jane, she is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. She is the author of Quaker Constitutionalism, and Political Thought of John Dickinson. It is a wonderful study. I don't know if anybody has quite gotten into the mind of John Dickinson as well as Jane has. And she's working on a biography that is extremely tantalizing. It is We Are Americans, the Inflexible Patriotism of John Dickinson, which is based on previously unknown correspondence and writings of Dickinson. And it's this work like that she's doing, that the project that she's also the director of, the John Dickinson Writing Project, is going to unearth more and more material. We're here today to celebrate the release of the first two volumes of the complete writings and selected correspondence of John Dickinson, which Jane, as the director and chief editor, has marshaled. So congratulations, Jane, and welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, there's a personal connection there too. Patrick and I were both fellows in residence at the old David Library of the American Revolution 15 years ago. And so it's kind of fun to see where we've come in those years. I can't tell if it feels like it was yesterday or like a lifetime ago. But anyway, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and hello to everyone, and welcome to the John Dickinson Symposium to announce the publication of the first 2 volumes of the complete writings and selected correspondence of John Dickinson. This moment has been a long time in coming. By one measure, it's 2 years overdue. COVID shut us down like everything else in 2020. By another, it took 10 years and about $1.5 million from the founding of the John Dickinson Writings Project, the JDP, in 2010 to publish the first volume. By a third measure, it was 20 years in the making. In 2002, I was a graduate student working on my dissertation. I had 1 chapter on Dickinson, but I hadn't gotten very far because of the dearth of sources on him. When I received an invitation to attend a Liberty Fund conference on Dickinson, hosted by Ken Bowling, and editor of the First Federal Congress Project, I thought that that would be a good opportunity to learn more. As Ken made introductions at the conference, he said that there was a Dickinson expert in our midst. Eager to meet this person and learn more and ask questions, I waited for Ken to point him out. Then he introduced me. Jim Green at the library company had given him my name. This was not, I assure you, any indication of my scholarly abilities. Rather, it tells you something about the abject poverty of Dickinson scholarship, that perhaps the only person in the entire country working on him was a graduate student with 1 half-baked chapter. I didn't know it, but the seeds of this event were planted then, thanks to Jim and Ken. By a fourth measure, this symposium is 2 centuries overdue. From when Dickinson died in 1808, and Americans were certain he would be remembered and revered by posterity. Over the course of this event, tonight in Jack Rakove's address and tomorrow at our panels, you will see the glaring Dickinson-shaped hole in our prior understanding of the American founding. My hope is that this event will raise awareness of the rich resources the JDP is unearthing and encourage more scholarship on him, more insights on the founding era, and a better sense of our way forward as a country with a past more usable than what we are used to. Before I turn it over to Professor Rakove, I would like to thank the people and organizations who have made the JDP possible. First and foremost, I'm especially pleased to recognize the people who too frequently are the unsung heroes of the historical profession, the editors and archivists. Before I became an editor myself, I hadn't the first inkling of what documentary editors do. We historians blithely open their tidy volumes and effortlessly pluck the gems for our narratives, wholly unaware of the staggering amount of meticulous labor that goes into each one of them. In the 12 years I've directed the JDP, I've had the honor of working alongside some of the best editors in the country who have helped bring order and meaning to Dickinson's otherwise inscrutable drafts. These scholars are doing the most difficult work in the historical profession. They must possess not merely deep historical knowledge, but also paleographic skills to read handwriting that to us mere mortals appears as hieroglyphics, research skills to find long-forgotten persons and facts, and an eye for detail to find a grain of sand out of place in the desert. 3 of the JDP staff members are here this evening: Nathan Kozit-Skanich, David Hoth, and our newest team member, Ian Iverson. Please give them a hand. Of all the founders, Dickinson's papers are the most difficult to edit. It's not merely because of his advanced training in the law, intimate knowledge of legal casebooks, and language reflecting medieval ideas and traditions. It's not only because of his love of literature, poetry, history, political theory, and scripture that he used to illustrate his writings and correspondence. And it isn't even because of his notoriously messy drafts with interlineations and idiosyncratic abbreviations. It's also because, for these reasons, many of his papers haven't been properly identified and cataloged in the archives. Which brings me to the next people who deserve recognition, and that's the archivists. For most of the nearly 25 years I've been working on Dickinson, many have helped, for which I'm grateful. But 3 individuals in particular worked doggedly with me to exhume the long-buried manuscripts. Connie King, former archivist at the Library Company of Philadelphia, now retired. Sarah Heim, former archivist at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, now at UPenn's Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. And Steve Smith, current archivist at the HSP. They tirelessly retrieved boxes, many repeatedly, and were able to hunt down items that were practically mythical for all the information that existed on them. Were it not for their skill and dedication and going out of their way to help, my own efforts would have been much less fruitful. Please join me in applauding them and their work. Documentary editions are very expensive to produce, yet scholarly interest in figures such as Dickinson has decreased in recent years, making funding and publishing extraordinarily difficult. I'm therefore deeply grateful for the financial support the JDP has received. Without funding from several entities, public and private, the project would not have begun, let alone survive. The main ones are the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the State of Delaware, the William Nelson Cromwell Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, as well as several other private individuals and groups. I'm also grateful to the University of Delaware Press for recognizing the ongoing importance of having printed volumes and prioritizing the benefit of these to the public over their bottom line. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my husband, Eric Kiltonen, and his parents, John and Pauline, and my own mother, Jennifer Patterson, who have been unwavering supporters through more drama than family members should have to endure. Colleagues, too, have encouraged and supported me. Foremost among them is Jennifer Sturzer at our partner organization, the University of Virginia's Center for Digital Editing. Sometimes other support has come in unexpected ways. Just after I got tenure, a well-meaning colleague took me aside and warned me that continuing my work on Dickinson would kill my career. If this is what career suicide looks like, I'll take it. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to remember the historian who was originally slated to deliver the keynote this evening. When I conceived of this event and pondered what themes of Dickinson's life I wanted to highlight, 2 names came immediately to mind: Jack Rakove and Gary Nash. I decided to ask Gary because he would highlight the work Dickinson did to elevate subordinated populations and bring them into the political discourse. Gary's death in 2021 was a blow to the historical profession and also a personal one. Now, Jack is not a second choice, he's simply a different choice. This evening, he will speak to you about Dickinson's conscience-based stance on political moderation, and as this is a main theme of my forthcoming biography on Dickinson, it couldn't be more appropriate. Jack Rakove hardly needs an introduction to this audience, but I will give him a brief one nonetheless. A member of the APS, he is William R. Coe Professor of History and Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Stanford University. His 9 books include Original Meanings, Political Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, which won the 1997 Pulitzer Prize in History. A sign of the relevance of his work is that he has also written numerous amicus briefs for the Supreme Court, including one he's just finishing now. He is, as he will tell you, a Madison guy. But he's also one of the few people whom I did not need to convince of Dickinson's importance. His treatment of Dickinson's draft of the Articles of Confederation remains the best out there. Please join me in welcoming Jack Rakove.
Well, first off, it's a great introduction. It's a great honor to me to have first this introduction from Jane, and then also her mention of Gary Nash. So I want to start by saying I think of Jane as John Dickinson's warrior queen. It may not be quite the best metaphor to put out here, and particularly given Dickinson's Quaker background, but somehow I think it fits the situation. Well, I know, because I've had a little involved with it, that what Jane has done is just, of her accomplishments in terms of pushing her work forward really is of almost heroic proportions in itself. Secondly, it's a great honor to have been asked to speak in Gary Nash's place. I mean, Gary was a great historian in so many senses of the term. There are a couple of his books I might have couple of misgivings about, but on the other hand, I always remember thinking back, actually literally the Nixon years when I was working on my orals in graduate school, of the 200 or 300 books I read in 1970, 71. One of my very favorites was Gary's first book, Quakers in Politics, which remains, I think, possibly the single best monograph on political behavior in any American colony prior to the Revolution. And of course, Gary's interests were so wide-ranging, and he was a historian of Philadelphia, in part, of Pennsylvania, the province, of African-American life, of anti-slavery, its connections, of course, to Quakerism, the Society of Friends. So it's an honor to be able to succeed him. We have standing behind me, portraits, I suppose, of, the three most eminent members of the American Philosophical Society. I wouldn't mind if Madison were up there too, since he was one as well. But so we have Franklin, Washington, Jefferson. I won't say more about their legacies. They are three of the big six. And since Jane was talking about the role of documentary editors, it's kind of a common cliche among historians, or those of us who, for better or for worse, participate in what's called founder chic, to talk about the big six, who include Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, and John Adams. John Dickinson does not belong in that rank, and I don't mean this in any kind of disparaging sense, but just because we have this kind of almost literary term self-identified cluster of the preeminent Founders Republic. So I think it's fair to say that we put Dickinson in what I'll mostly call a second level of leaders, but that does nothing to take away from many of his accomplishments. He was, after all, the author of the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and as Jane makes clear in her biography, the manuscript for which I've been dabbling in. That, in a sense, that pamphlet was as preeminent in American political writing before independence, let's say, as Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Maybe you might toss in John Adams' Thoughts on Government, maybe kind of running third, but Letters from American Farmer and Common Sense were the two preeminent political treatises, or treatises isn't quite the right term, political tracts in terms of their impact on American politics. He was the leading author of the Articles of Confederation, and working in his draft, which I remember doing some detail back in the early 1970s when I was doing my doctoral work, was quite stimulating to me. It's clear that it really was Dickinson's work. It's we don't know much about how many congressional committees operated, so you have to be a little careful about drawing conclusions that are too precise. But even so. Clearly, Dickinson was the presiding genius behind it. And he was, of course, one of the framers of the Constitution. And he, of course, had been at the Stamp Act Congress 1765. So that's a bit like Roger Sherman of Connecticut, dabbling in all the important experiments which basically define the Revolution era. On the other hand, we also recall Dickinson for a couple of other idiosyncratic reasons. He balked at signing the Declaration of Independence. And in effect, he left Congress before the Articles of Confederation he'd been drafting actually came up for discussion. He was, in a sense, he was happy to be relieved of his duties. If you read the notes for what may or may not have been one of his final addresses to Congress, you have a sense of, coming from Dickinson, of genuine relief at being able finally to put his public duties behind him. In a sense, I think Dickinson was bearing, I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, Dickinson was bearing a kind of curse of celebrity. People had such high expectations of him, and he had such high expectations of himself, that he placed himself in a psychologically demanding position. And while he always wanted to remain a firm and vigorous and active advocate of the common cause, which became the cause of American independence, there was a sense in which I think, at least in, the late 1770s, he was happy to kind of get out of too active an involvement in politics, to remain a patriot and to remain active, but in a more discreet way, and then to be kind of called back into more active public service in the 1780s. And I think framing what I'll call it, I don't know if I should call it the Dickinson problem. It's not quite the same as we talk about the Madison problem, for example, which I don't think is a problem either, because I worked it out. There is an aspect. There are aspects of Dickinson's career. So the full title of this talk tonight is called "John Dickinson: Political Conscience and the Dilemma of the Moderates." And I think I want to start by talking about the dilemma of the moderates. By moderates, I mean people like John Dickinson, John Jay from New York, James Duane from New York, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, Thomas Johnson from Maryland, a handful of others. The members of the Continental Congress, who were certainly vigorous patriots in their own way, but who were very cautious, quite prudent about the risks of declaring independence, and were the group within Congress who had to be persuaded that this was the right thing to do. So on the one hand, they're no less committed to the underlying principles or the underlying goals and motifs of the whole movement for independence. On the other hand, they're a great deal more cautious and more temperate and more prudent about it. And so their dilemma, as push comes to shove, and in a sense, almost with each passing week or each passing month in 1776, was whether or not to go ahead with the decision for independence. In the end, they all took the choice that I think Dickinson, in a sense, took half a step, or maybe not a full step, but took half a step back from. And so to kind of consider Dickinson's relationship with the other moderates, moderate leaders, most primarily from the middle colonies becoming the middle states, is in a sense the kind of explanatory analytical problem that I want to play around with in the body of my remarks. But before I do that, though, and I think particularly with Patrick Sparrow sitting here, because this is something we've talked about previously, we'll talk about again, it's worth saying just a couple words about where we stand at this moment in the historiography of the American Revolution, broadly defined. And then I'm going to go ahead and tell a much more pointed story about 1774, 75, 76, the years I call the crisis of independence. The nation is, scholars in particular, but the nation in general, is confronting, if not a crisis, at least a set of challenges as to how do we think about what we sometimes call Revolution 250, meaning the quarter millennium celebration, commemoration, reckoning with the American decision for independence in 1776. And as I've thought about this, and I think I've said this to Patrick before, but elaborated on this a bit, it seems to me there are three basic stories that we need to tell. First, the most familiar, the most conventional, the one I basically spent my whole career working on, is essentially the political story. It's a story about, I'll say primarily men, events, decisions, particular moments in time when political actors have to choose to do one thing or another. It's reflected in, in a sense, this motif gives us a kind of set of ongoing themes that essentially started in the middle 1760s with the debate over the Stamp Act and the Revenue Act and the Declaratory Act and the Townshend duties and so on, and then moves ahead to the decision for independence and the adoption of the first state constitutions, which Jane and Bill Ewald and I have spending a lot of time thinking about the last few weeks, and then culminates in the late 1780s, early 1790s with the adoption of the Constitution. There is a political story which lies at the heart. What makes the revolution in some fundamental sense is a set of political decisions. And being a rather old-fashioned historian myself, making sense of why those decisions were made, and who were the actors and who were the decision makers and what factors were the constraints and so on and so on. That remains, it seems to be, still quite a fascinating, interesting challenge. But that doesn't suffice for the profession as a whole. So there are two other major motifs, which I think are complementary of one another, that have also come into play. The first is what's simply called the experience of living through the revolution. What we might say is its social history. And actually, since we brought up Gary Nash in this context, I think Gary would, fit this model very well, in the sense that we want to know what the revolution meant to ordinary Americans of every location, gender, race, religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the experience of revolution, which may or may not have causal importance, may or may not explain why events happen, but it's certainly a way of thinking about their impact, positive, negative, destabilizing, whatever. Multiple possibilities here. That's the whole point of doing it. So the second way to think about this, in a sense, we want to democratize the revolution, not in the sense of decision-making, but in the sense of understanding a collective experience and how it brought, Americans of all kinds, either how it either inspired them, affected them, potentially oppressed and, depressed them, and so on and so on. So that's the second one. And then the third thing, just to be mentioned here, is what's called vast early America, which I associate primarily, well, first and foremost with Karen Wolf, who's the director of the Omaha Institute of Early American History and Culture down at Williamsburg. It's in a sense, it's not unlike the social history, except it amplifies one dimension of it. It's a reminder that, after all, when we speak about the American Revolution, we are speaking about a set of events whose effects, implications, stretch well into the interior of the North American continent. There are repercussions taking place out on the Great Plains among Native American peoples. The last battle of revolution, of course, takes place, the Revolutionary War takes place in India. It affects the Loyalist exiles. It affects different communities in different ways. Whether you live in the Gulf of Mexico or, up in, Maine, still part of Massachusetts. So there's the idea of having a vast early America. So I think just to get this point out there, the story I want to tell is going to be, unsurprisingly, particularly if I'm at the rostrum, is going to be primarily a political story. But for all of us thinking about this, trying to think about where does the story fit into some larger matrix or some larger framework, some larger narrative events, we have to think about these complementary, but sometimes occasionally disparate categories of analysis. Political, social, geographic might be the simplest way to put it. These are all important dimensions, and we can't appreciate the significance of the revolution as a whole if we don't wrestle with all their implications. Now, Dickinson's story, to come back to it, certainly belongs category number one, and that's the framework with which I'm going to explain it. One could say that Dickinson's complicated relations with the Society of Friends would also be, could represent another aspect of this, but I do think, in the sense of the social history, I'm not sure how important a role Society of Friends are going to have in that larger social history story. So this is going to be primarily a political story. It's funny, I had this when I was getting ready to work out the outlines for this talk, and kind of browsing in Jane's manuscript biography, I realized that we hit upon the same idea, which is, it occurred to me that Dickinson was, in a sense, America's first political celebrity. He wasn't, to go back to these gentlemen, just maybe make this comparison. I actually think, and this is something maybe Jane and I can argue about, I actually kind of think that Franklin was America's first transatlantic celebrity, because of his reputation as a scientist and a man of letters and so on. Washington, if any of you have read David A. Bell's book on political charisma, Washington, I know it's a little hard for us to think about it, but Washington actually was a charismatic leader akin to Napoleon and others. Toussaint Louverture, going back to Pascal Paoli in Corsica, Simon Bolivar, and so on. We think of Washington as a charismatic leader. And Jefferson, of course, has a kind of, Jefferson is the guy whose moral legacy we're still wrestling with year in and year out as Americans. So they have a kind of basis of fame of somewhat different orders of magnitude. But I think Jane is correct to say Dickinson was our first political celebrity. I don't think I'd appreciate, until I was going through material, I don't think I'd appreciate fully, what an epical work the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer were. They had a remarkable clarifying impact on the arguments Americans have made. On the standard story, which I think is still correct, is that Dickinson closed this kind of window that had left open, that Benjamin Franklin had somewhat left open when Franklin testified before the House of Commons in terms of trying to get the Stamp Act repealed in 1766. Franklin had kind of put together this interesting distinction about what kinds of taxes were Americans willing to accept and what kind were they, bound to oppose. And kind of Franklin, in fact, was, not a trimmer, but was trying to create a little bit of wiggle room in the American distinctions. And then Charles Townsend kind of takes advantage of Franklin's distinction and says, well, okay, if taxes on imports are legitimate, under, the theory supporting, the British Revenue Acts. Let's try taxing them that way, for the same purposes. And the simple story here is Dickinson comes along and says, well, if it looks like a tax, walks like a tax, quacks like a tax, which is what the Townsend duties were, in the end, it's a tax. So, let's forget about Franklin's distinction, and, we know the basis of our opposition. So I think Jane demonstrates, in fact, I mean, that's a standard story about, in a sense, what makes Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer so important in a moment in terms of the overall development and elaboration of American constitutional arguments. I think Jane makes a pretty good case that there are many other layers of meaning, and let's say levels of argumentation and interpretation embedded in the letters that help to explain its impact. As I said earlier, I think until you get to Common Sense in 1776, no other pamphlet has quite the same impact that the Letters from the Farmer did. Maybe John Adams' Thoughts on Government, which I do think also played a kind of similar, which comes out in April 1776, has a kind of similar focusing effect in terms of thinking about the project of writing Republican constitutions of government. So that might be number 3, but a couple laps or whatever behind the other two. Dickinson was also the Liberty Song. The author of the Liberty Song, and I think Jane in her slides had the chorus from the Liberty Song come up. I tried once in one of my Stanford classes to have my students sing it. You sing it to the tune "Hearts of Oak," which is a well-known British Royal Navy sea medley from the 18th century. You could download the music. I passed out the lyrics. I was the only one singing. Which of course is often the case in my classes, since I sometimes lapse into doo-wop, which I won't do here tonight. Either. But you think about the Liberty Song. So here's Dickinson on the one hand writing this powerful pamphlet, which has really does have a dramatic clarifying impact, and then working in a sense at the level of popular political culture. Here's a song we can all sing when we rally around the Liberty Tree, or whatever. And as Jane also notes, I mean, Dickinson's reputation on the basis of letters became transatlantic. In fact, she notes, I think by 1770. It was being read and cited in Vienna. I wonder, think if there's any kind of Viennese coffee, that would be named after the farmer, but you haven't been able to come up with a name appropriate. So that establishes, that's one way of thinking about Dickens's initial celebrity, and in a sense both the opportunities but also the burdens it imposed on him. It made Dickinson into an individual. The rare individual, I mean, there are a handful of others, but one of the rare individuals who any person trying to organize political purposes will want to recruit to his cause. That's to say, as a political celebrity, with this kind of reputation, having Dickinson on your side would be, in terms of political argumentation, trying to strategize maneuvers, would be an asset. So, for example, it's interesting. There's an exchange, which actually I quoted in my first book, which came out a long time ago, between Samuel Adams and John Dickinson in 1773, when Adams, I think, was trying to recruit Dickinson to maybe come up and give the annual Boston Massacre address or something like that. Something he tried to get John Adams to do. John Adams begged off, saying, "I'm too old to be giving declamations. I just want to practice law." At this point. In a sense, by converting himself into a celebrity, Dickinson, in effect, exposed himself to the influence-wielding desires and inclinations of others. And yet, at the same time, he fits very well, I think, within the framework of what my late friend and colleague Pauline Maier called the Colonial Radicals. Pauline's use of the term radical does not fit the standard left-right spectrum or framework that we use. By radical, she meant individuals like Samuel Adams, Charles Thompson, known as the Sam Adams of Philadelphia, the Lee, Arthur and Richard Henry Lee, the Lee family from Virginia, Alexander McDougall in New York. That group of colonial leaders who were most inclined to be most suspicious of underlying British motives in the politics of the American Revolutionary period. The kind of people who really would fall very, very well under my mentor, Bernard Balin's, framework for explanation. The ones most likely to embody, exude, act upon the kind of radical political ideology that Balin argues Americans had derived from, the so-called Commonwealth or real Whig tradition of politics, and which Pauline Maier tried to develop in more kind of narrative detail in her first book, From Resistance to Revolution. Dickinson was one of those radicals in that sense. He may have been a moderate in a different context once you get to actual decision moments, 1774, 1775, 76, but in terms of his anticipation of what was at stake and what Americans had to be concerned with and what they had to worry about, Dickinson falls in, can be categorized as one of those radicals. And that, I think, illustrates one last point I want to make here, which is, I think, and this is an area I think historians need to do more work on, is that, perhaps an area I think where I might disagree with Gary Nash and certainly with Woody Holton, is that the situation Americans were in, or even radical leaders were in, they always had to respond to British initiatives. The radicals were not a group of Trotskyites fomenting or plotting a revolution or a movement towards independence. I think in some ways, and I published a whole book on the subject called Revolutionaries, they became revolutionaries in spite of themselves in response to a set of actions and initiatives that the British, for its own reason, had undertaken. If there's one systematic flaw, I think, in American thinking about the revolution, is that very few American historians, other than Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, have really taken a serious account of British decision-making. We don't pay it as much attention as we need to do to understand why the revolution actually took place. So I think one key thing to keep in mind here is that however radical you were, whether you're Samuel Adams in Boston or John Dickinson or Charles Thompson here, or the Lee, or one of the Lee family down in Virginia, or McDougal and Isaac Sears in New York, or any of the, I can't say household names, but any of those names of major historians, you were always dependent upon British initiatives, which meant there's a kind of upper bound, upper limit to what to what you think you can do. So that's all the deep background for what I want to say. Now let's cut to the chase, meaning let's focus on the crisis for independence, which became the crucial moment, both for critical political decision-making and for matters of conscience to come to the fore. So there are two key moments here. They both took place across the street. I mean, it's remarkable to be in this building and be able to say, actually, it's true in my career. Most of what I've written about took place across the street from where I'm standing now. The first Continental Congress, which met at Carpenter's Hall, which I guess is now up for some massive renewal, which is just to the east of us, down Chestnut. And then, of course, Independence Hall, which is directly across the street and in a little kitty corner across the street. So the two moments I really want to talk about is first, just generally the first Continental Congress. And don't have too much to say about that, but something important to say about Dickinson's relationship to it. And then secondly, the first session of the Second Continental Congress, meaning the session which met from early May, I think it's May 10th, to early mid-August 1775, then amazingly adjourned, and then reconvened in the fall of 1775, and then sat thereafter. What I really want to talk about is just a set of opening debates in the Second Continental Congress, in which Dickinson played a critical but somewhat problematic role. And I want to rely actually on really one document, the notes of debate, well, not one, but primarily one, the notes of debate kept by Silas Dean, which, to pick up on Jane's point about documentary editors, I think I'm the only scholar, to be honest, and I don't mean this to sound too chutzpahdik, but I think I'm the only scholar who's ever paid close attention to Silas Dean's diary, which is extremely elliptical and extremely revealing. It's one of those documents where you want to milk and work word for word, sentence for sentence. You really don't have much more than a sentence here or there. But it is so revealing of what was going on in Congress that I think we don't, but so elliptical that we don't fully grasp its significance. And I think both in terms of Dickinson and in terms of the larger story, it's quite important. Okay, so the first Continental Congress met here in early September 1774. It was convened, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the arrival of the news of the four so-called coercive or intolerable acts, followed by the Quebec Act in the spring and summer of 1774. It leads very quickly to a collective movement. Instead of letting the Boston radicals kind of dictate what the policy for all the colonies should be, there's a general agreement that that there should be an intercolonial Congress. Every colony joins, but Georgia, which at this point is just a kind of set of frontier colonies, kind of almost a subcolony of South Carolina. Dickinson was not there at the present, at the moment when it convened. And the reason he was there at the present was his rivalry with Galloway, Joseph Galloway, the leader, Franklin's sometime ally, later opponent, eventually a loyalist. Galloway and Dickinson were political rivals within the context of Pennsylvania politics. Galloway kept Dickinson off the delegation. Now here's a counterfactual. Historians shouldn't use counterfactuals, though. I was just, my two colleagues here know I was just pushing one relating to the amicus brief we've been working on. It is worth asking, suppose Dickinson had been here at the very beginning. Dickinson joined the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress, 2 weeks before it adjourned. So eventually the Assembly does elect him and send him on. He's in demand. His absence is kind of, itself is conspicuous. So he's going to fortify and, A, the Pennsylvania delegation, and B, the reputation of the Congress. So it makes sense to have him there. But when he arrives, Congress has basically reached most of the decisions that matter. Dickinson works on, does a lot of editorial labor on our first petition to George III. But he's not there in time to have any substantive impact, at least as I read it, on the debates. Maybe Jane and I will argue about this over dinner, I don't know. But it seems to me it's a more interesting question. I suppose Dickinson had been there. If you want to run a counterfactual, it's worth that. It's just like asking, suppose Adams and Jefferson had been at the Constitutional Convention. That's a good counterfactual. There's no way you can answer it, but it's worth speculating about. So suppose Dickinson had been there at the beginning. Maybe it would have made a difference. Maybe not. The key thing I believe, and which I've argued for a long time, is that Congress had already reached the key decisions it needed to reach, and those decisions, without even going to the substance of them, realize, in a sense, exposed and confirmed the failure of British policy from the get-go. So what do I mean by that? The logic of British strategy, and this is where we have to think like political historians, so you have to bear with me on this. The logic of British strategy in the aftermath of the news of the Boston Tea Party reaching Lord North's government in the winter of 1774 was to make an example of Massachusetts. I'd like to lapse into French here because the pun works. Pour décourager les autres. There's pour encourager les autres. This is pour décourager les autres, to discourage the others, to demonstrate to all the other 12 colonies the costs of defying imperial policy. So what are you going to do? You shut down the port of Boston until they make restitution for the tea that's brewed, more or less, in the harbor. You're going to alter the charter of government of Massachusetts. You're going to amend the Administration of Justice Act so the British officials will not be tried by colonial juries. You do this minor tinkering with the Quartering Act, which is not itself all that important, but does have important links to British constitutional history. And then, of course, the Quebec Act comes along. The key idea here was you're going to make an example of Massachusetts. And what happens, I won't say from the get-go, but what happens, at least from the summer of 1774, is that strategy breaks down. Far from detaining the other colonies, everybody except the Georgians, who are just too isolated to get caught up in this, everybody shows up and appears at, make a quorum in Carpenter's Hall. By the way, I understand that at the time, and you can correct me wrong, Carpenter's Hall, now you walk into one big grand room, but as I understand, in 1774, there was actually a smaller committee room off on one side where these 55 guys would have been crammed into a space about maybe from here to the back row. I mean, not just, it wasn't the most expansive place to meet. So that's the first failure. The second failure, it seems, is that far from, so A, not just place the colonies to meet, that's failure number two. When the Continental Congress met, the positions they took, by my standard, were pretty far-reaching. They essentially confirmed the American position that we are not subject to the legislative jurisdiction of Parliament, which back in 1766 it said in the Declaratory Act, Americans or American colonies were subject to the decisions of Parliament, quote unquote, in all cases whatsoever. Americans say no, they work out the standard arguments about representation and its relationship to parliamentary sovereignty. They reject those arguments. The only thing they accept, and Dickinson is a major part of this discussion, both in 74 and 1775, is the question, shouldn't we allow Parliament to continue to regulate trade? the imperial trade as it had done in the Navigation Acts. I mean, isn't that the best, isn't that the framework that's really what's making the whole British Empire work? It has to be directed from somewhere. We can't direct it from Boston or New Haven or Savannah or Norfolk or whatever. So it makes sense to have one central agency that's going to regulate this. But we're going to offer that up not as a confession of right, not as a matter of authority, but essentially as a political concession. This is what's making the empire work, and we agree that you should take the lead. And then finally, just a statement of simple political fact, and here it helps, my way of reasoning, it helps that I'm a native Chicago, Cook County Democrat. And then my father studied with Hans Morgenthau, the great realist, critic of American foreign policy. The simple fact that the Congress met in the first place, and that it ended, the first Congress met, and that it ended its deliberations by calling into being the so-called association, which was in effect a framework for revolutionary committees, for committees of inspection and safety, or whatever you want to call them, to mobilize at the community level. In fact, we're creating a revolutionary apparat across the American countryside, which leads effectively to the immediate collapse of royal authority throughout the colonies. And royal governors start saying this. These guys are more powerful, they have as much influence as the colonial legislatures or the normal institutions of government ever had. There is an effective government in place, and there's nothing we can do that can stop it. So in a sense, the logic here is everything that took place in 1774 demonstrated that the British were really strategically, it really screwed things up. It's not the best way to put it, but really that it had badly miscalculated and should have reassessed their options, should have reassessed their strategy. Instead, what happens, of course, is the opposite. Rather than rethink their policy in the winter of 1775, winter of 1775 is a lot like the winter of 1774. Nobody knew in the post the Boston Tea Party, nobody knew what the British government was going to do after the Boston Tea Party. John Adams, in April 1774, says, we shall see, I should know this by heart because I've quoted so often, but he says, he thinks relations between Britain and America will fluctuate the ocean and vacillate for more generations to come than you or I shall live. Our grandchildren may see revolutions that we can't imagine. 4 weeks later, the Boston Port Act appears, and, the entire calculus of politics changes. Winter 1775 was like that too, because nobody knew how the Continental Congress was going to react. But then in April 1775, when Thomas Gage makes the fatal mistake under pressure from the government to send, his troops out to Concord and with a little way by at Lexington en route, civil war erupts. It's confirmed by the Battle of Bunker Hill. These are two British defeats. And actually, if you read Woody Holton's book, at least one thing I like about it is I do think his treatment of the war is quite good, and I think his treatment of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill or Breeds Hill, whatever you want to call it, is quite good. So, so again, in fact, the British have doubled down, and the consequence of this is the eruption of civil war. Okay. Now, that sets the stage for what I think remains a strangely neglected debate in the Continental Congress. So Congress was still in recess. It reconvened in early May 1774. And on May 16th, we know from Silas Deane's diary, debate begins. All he tells us is Richard Henry Lee from Virginia introduces, quote unquote, proposals for raising an army. At that point, Thomas Lynch and John Rutledge from South Carolina interject. They say, what are our aims? In effect, they ask, do we want independence? And I think he uses independence in the full sense of the term, or return to the status quo ante, meaning our situation, the colonial situation as in 1763, which in a sense had been kind of the position of the First Continental Congress. And then John Adams then interjects, and this is Dean's language, independence on Parliament is absolutely to be averred in the Americans, but a dependence on the Crown is what we own. In other words, we are going to maintain our total rejection of parliamentary legislative authority over us, except if we negotiate something on the issue of trade. We're going to insist, as James Wilson had written back in 1768 and published in 1774, and as Thomas Jefferson had written in some review of the rights of British America, we're going to maintain that our proper connection to the British Empire is through the Crown, nothing more, nothing less. Now, at this point, we know from Dean's notes that John Dickinson intervened. He gave a speech that ran about an hour in length, meaning it wasn't, and Jane and I've wrestled with a few Dickinson drafts of my own, so I know what she she and her co-editors have to struggle with. So who knows? I don't know how clean the draft actually was, but we know that an hour-long speech is a non-trivial length. It's not an interjection, a debate. It's something you've prepared to do. So Dickinson, again, I think now, since he's at the Second Congress ab initio from the beginning, not as a late arrival has been the case in 1784, Dickinson really wants to, interject himself or project himself significantly into the debate and rephrase and reset his terms. So Dickinson makes 3 points. He says, and this is quoting from Dean, first, a vigorous preparation for war. Second, a vigorous prosecution of it. Third, and most important, to strike out still a further plan for reconciliation if it is possible. On the last head, he speaks near an hour. Very timid. This is Silas U. Morgan. Very timid, which means, I don't mean fearful, but, timid in the sense of cautious. Very timid is for giving up entirely the regulating of trade, argues smoothly but sophistically. This may be a comment on his legal skills on the subject, and gives rather disgust. Mr. Wilson answers him generally, is not lengthy. Mr. Edward Rutledge, Edward Rutledge, long, etc. So this is really, I find this, again, it's just all we know about this debate. Dean is the only person who actually talks about it. So it's a very spare reference, but it's deeply revealing. It's an open debate about what are our objectives at the first order of magnitude. And Dickinson comes in with his own agenda, and that's a sophisticated agenda. So they have this preliminary, this initial airing of views. Congress then spent the next week doing what it had to do. It does a number of war-related measures. I mean, it's fine to talk about your ultimate aims, but since we had Lexington and Concord, and there was the Massachusetts Provisional Armies there, but we need to turn it into a real army, so we got to start undertaking those measures, et cetera, et cetera. So Congress goes about what might be called its ordinary, or sense also extraordinary business. But then a week later, they come back to the debate. On May 23rd. The question, as Dean recalls it, is, shall we treat? And again, Dickinson speaks in length. And again, now he has a different trilogy of marks. The first is collapse his initial first two, preparations for war. That's fairly obvious. 2, send a second petition. Dickinson had revised the first petition of the First Continental Congress that sent to George III, which of course the king ignored. Americans would not petition Parliament since they weren't represented there. Parliament were not their agent. So he sent a petition to the king. The king says, c'est la vie, or it's English equivalent. So the first petition ignored, but say, okay, let's send them another one, which is what I think we conventionally call the olive branch petition, even though the first one was ignored. And then Dickinson goes further. So he proposes sending agents to England to treat of an accommodation and to give them significant powers of negotiation. So Dickinson, again, is staking his reputation, or I'll say, I don't know if I should say betting his celebrity, but in fact combining his celebrity, his reputation, his distinction, and I think his own personal commitments as a matter of conscience. What should the optimal policy be to argue for accommodation? And he's just also, again, it comes back to the issue that we should recognize Parliament as an unequivocal right to regulate trade. So that's a big concession. We're not going to hedge on that. And then maybe we should make restitution for the tea, which is something the First Continental Congress had rejected. Though, if you read my friend Mary Beth Norton's book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, Mary Beth, also a member of this distinguished organization, Mary Beth makes an argument there. Again, the crucial thing from my way of thinking about Dickinson was the response from Congress. Nobody objected to the idea of a second olive branch petition per se. Most Algons thought it wouldn't do any good. If the first one had been ignored, what makes us think the second one will fail? Well, if the British are going to take issue with, the British kind of realize the severity of the crisis they've provoked because the Americans, now there's open civil war, maybe, and we can, and then we can keep talking about the trade issue. But the opinion of Congress was, we're not going to modify the positions of 1774. That's to say, we're willing to, we're willing to invite negotiations. We're willing to say we're open to them. We're willing to say we're still trying to petition for redress of grievances, which is the conventional mode of resistance. And then Dickinson was roundly attacked. So it's not just the positions he took. Dickinson himself, I think, was being attacked. It's not just the substance of what he was saying. I think he's being attacked more for his posture here. Silas also tells us he was attacked by Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Mifflin, a name should be familiar to all Pennsylvanians, if not to many other Americans, and also by John Rutledge, who could have been regarded earlier as an advocate of a more conciliatory policy. Rutledge, Dean says, was against any concession whatever. That Lord North has given us his ultimatum with which we cannot agree, treats Dickinson's plan with the utmost contempt. And at that point, relations got so bad, there were further explosions among the delegates who are now, of course, sitting across, not down the street, but across the street. So now they're over, in the State House, Independence Hall. Tempers got so disagreeable, Dean notes, that one half the Congress withdraw. Having been a historian, my first book is the history of the Congress, I know of no other incident like this. So this was really a kind of, I won't say a down and out moment, but this must have been a really bitter and passionate moment. I mean, Dickinson did have some delegates rally to his defense. I think some of the Maryland delegates did so. I mean, it wasn't just that he was a lone wolf, but he didn't represent the consensus, and Congress reaches a kind of breaking point. Now, I think the key word in this exchange was ultimatum. Lord North has given us his ultimatum. And that goes back to, North had made a very modest conciliatory proposal in early 1775. If the Americans agree to pay the taxes, then we'll rethink things. It was kind of, the sum of it all didn't satisfy the Americans. But I think that's the best way to understand the logic of what was going to happen over the next year. That's to say, between the spring of 1775, when this debate is taking place, and the spring of 1776, when the movement for independence became inexorable. It was just by which point it's just a matter of timing. What are the things we need to do, and when do we need to do them by? Now, I want to raise this point because, if I can, and somebody in authority here, I don't know, Patrick, is that you? If I'm going too long, give me the hook or give me some kind of, I won't do a Laurel Thatcher Ulrich if you were here for that talk. So, you can stop if I can. So I want to go back to a set of 3 points I made at the very beginning. I'm sure many of you know, and I've been a small part of this, there has been something of a controversy about the implications of Project 6019, a major controversy about the implications of Project 6019 for the teaching of American history. I want to say at the beginning, I agree with its overall objectives. I mean, I've studied American history for a half century now. The more you study it, and I think even particularly today, the more one realizes the primacy of issues of racial discrimination, oppression in American history. I would never minimize that for a second. But I do think the specific claim that Woody Holton made, in which Project 1619 built on, and were not really abandoned, that somehow the defense of colonial slavery from potential British interference based on Lord Dunmore's proclamation is complete and utter nonsense as an analytical explanation of what was going on. It presupposes that there's some problems, that you need this additional emphasis or impact or whatever that the slavery emancipation issue might have raised in the form of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. I just think that's completely wrong. Not that it's unimportant, not that it's trivial, not that it doesn't matter, because actually, although there are big debates about how many African Americans fled to British lines, but I follow Cassandra Pybus and saying 10,000 sounds like a pretty good figure for the revolution as a whole, et cetera, et cetera. But the logic of independence, as a political historian, trying to explain why were decisions made that determine the outcome of events. I think the essential decisions had all been made by the summer of 1775. That's to say, 4 or 5 months before Dunmore's proclamation. And the major political decisions on both sides are basically to stick to ultimata. The Americans say, we're not abandoning where we were in 1774. There are a couple things we're fudged. If you guys want to talk, we'll talk. The British doubled down on their strategy. It failed in 1774, but rather than say, maybe we ought to rethink what we're doing, They doubled down in 1775. They refused to recognize, I won't say the legitimacy, but the reality of congressional power. They refused to accept the fact that their rule in the countryside has effectively collapsed. They refused to deal with the situation on the ground. Instead, they assume, since they are the dominant power in the Atlantic world in the 18th century, that, to use the Lockean phrase, which actually goes back to the story of Iftach in the Book of Judges, that the appeal to heaven. It's a single verse in the Book of Judges, which is Locke's source for the idea. I think biblical source for the appeal to heaven. We're going to try the appeal. The Americans will try the appeal to heaven, and British, in fact, are on the same side. We're going to let the outcome on the battlefield determine, let's say the course of the conflict. They're actually on perfectly plausible assumptions. They are the dominant power in the Atlantic world, dealing with a bunch of I think, to use a phrase John Shai used, battered yokels in the American countryside. These guys aren't going to be able to stand up to us. In fact, we know the opposite, it turns out to be the case. So in this sense, I think, even though it's the kind of very old-fashioned history I've done all my life, I think you need to know this stuff. You need to be able to kind of make sense of this process of decision-making, which in many ways remains an elite model of political action. You have to worry about public opinion. But these are systems that are, in a sense, run, even in revolution, are kind of run by political elites. At least where critical moments are determined by political elites. You have to be able to reconstruct that decision. Once you do, I think the argument that you'd have like a social historical explanation of why the revolution occurred, or the vast early America is part of it too. I mean, those are still interesting topics, but for other reasons. So now let me come back on just maybe 4 or 5 concluding remarks about John Dickinson. We can open this up for questions. So here are just a few reflections I've had about Dickinson, and I'm anxious to see Jane's book come out so I can figure out how well if my hypothesis about celebrity makes as much sense as some of the other ones. So we'll see. As I think about Dickinson, obviously was by far and away, the most distinguished moderate leader. But in a sense, he was kind of a political loner. He's certainly allied with all the other moderates, his name I mentioned. But they criticized him freely. I don't think he was part of their political bloc, in a certain sense. I mean, their sentiments are similar, but they criticize him pretty strongly when Dickinson takes the initiative. So it's not as if he's crafting a strategy that people who think a lot like him in some respects are being likely to follow. I think in Dickinson's own case, to pursue this point, I think perhaps because Dickinson had that celebrity status, in which once you have it, it's hard to forget it and hard to ignore it. And perhaps because he felt he knew Britain better than any of his allies. And I think this goes back, volume 1, I use these letters forever in my teaching, but the letters that Dickinson wrote home when he goes to London in 1774, 1754, 55 are wonderful letters. I mean, they're just so brilliant and so intriguing and so much fun to work with in their own right. But it also means Dickinson knew a lot about British politics from firsthand observation that I think a lot of contemporaries had to rely simply on what they'd read. So it may have been that these factors, partly because of his own status and partly because of his memories and his impressions, he felt conscience-driven to insist on a more active posture of accommodation, even when he could fail to convince his colleagues in Congress to follow that path. But his colleagues in Congress, people like Robert Morris, Governor Morris, so you had a couple more names in here. Robert Morris's statue is actually right nearby here. Robert Morris, Governor Morris, Wilson, Jay, Duane, Robert Livingston, etc. They had their own sense of conscience of a different kind. These guys were all desperate for reconciliation. They were no less committed than Dickinson was to the idea that the optimal outcome should be some kind of bona fide process of negotiation accommodation between the British government, Lord North's ministry, and involving the king, and the Americans. They were desperately eager to see the British government finally send over its peace commission. And they keep asking, where the hell are these guys? They say, I'm convinced it would have been so easy to accommodate us if they'd only be willing to negotiate with us. The Stairway historians put it, suppose George III had made a royal tour of the American colonies. With that of South, that's another interesting counterfactual. Not you'd never put a king on a ship and send him across the Atlantic to visit a bunch of provincial backwaters, across the Atlantic. But they could have sent the commissioners earlier. If you read Julia Favel's great book on the Howe family and the American Revolution, and I should say Julia and I share, we are kind of Philadelphians in Moncay, since she's a Bryn Mawr grad and I'm a Haverford guy. We've both been in the PLV local, which I'm sure many of you have done on one occasion or another. The moderates were desperate for reconciliation. The Howe brothers, if Julia Favel is right, saw that possibility. They got nowhere. Their own disillusion with the government, I think, I think in a sense, stems that failure. Had the government pursued what the Howe brothers wanted, what I think Benjamin Franklin had tried to promote until he comes home thoroughly disillusioned with British politics in the spring of 1775, right after the events I was describing earlier. Had the British government sent a commission over, let's say by the end of 1775, early 1776, with, with some leeway, with some discretion, I think it would have stopped the movement towards independence dead in its tracks. I think the moderates at that point, far from being somewhat divided over exactly what do we do now, the moderates, in the absence of any positive sign from the British of reconciliation, the moderates, in fact, they have their own crisis of conscience. And where Dickinson decides to leave Congress, I think is an act of conscience, although supporting the cause, he did no longer want to feel fully complicit with its decisions. In a sense, didn't, however that calculus worked. In the end, they made their own decisions. And they were, and they did it, they didn't trust all the other radicals, as we sometimes use the term. They didn't trust the Adamses and the Lees. There's lots of letters saying they're very suspicious about their motives. They think these guys may have been, planning independence all along. So it's not that, they're huckstered into, supporting the independence. They had some basis for disagreement. But the government, the British government, in effect, wiped that out. So the big counterfactual here is, had the British not made a major strategic error at the beginning, and then, in effect, doubled down on it in 1775 and replicated again in 1776, there's nothing inevitable about July 4th. Had commissioners come with some authority, would have stopped everything. In fact, what happens when the Howe brothers show up, their only authority really is to grant Americans pardon. So you sometimes say, "Geh gesund." I mean, where's that going to take you? It's just not, it's not substantive. It doesn't deal with the gravity of the event. So they had their own crisis of conscience, and they decided we are revolutionaries. And we're going to take that risk. We'll see some opportunities. Robert Morris certainly saw some opportunities arising from the revolution, and which is not to say he became a revolutionary because he saw the opportunities, but when the revolution occurred, he knew what the opportunities were. Those are two very different causal statements, and I want to be clear about it. Dickinson could not go that far. But when you read the draft, again, it's another messy Dickinson text of what was probably a speech he gave just before he left Congress. It's not a very satisfactory analysis. I don't think it really holds. I mean, he worries a lot about how the French are going to react. He does a lot of speculation about his own. Maybe, shouldn't we wage one more campaign still? Most Americans say, no, okay, we have, if we want to get French aid, we have to demonstrate that we're going to break with Britain. Dickinson's position is more like, well, we have to demonstrate we have staying power in order for the French to side with us. I think the other guys say, no, the time has come. We can't get anything from this government, without making the appeal, to use Locke's phrase, without making the appeal to heaven. And so Dickinson, in a sense, is left there. I mean, he's a noble character. He has, as Jane shows in her book, he has these deep and very interesting roots in a number of Quaker Society of Friends kinds of motifs. Makes him a fascinating character, I think, Jane, to deal with biographically. Hope you live up to the promise, that I'm laying out here. But in the end, his crisis of conscience kind of put him off on, I won't say on a tangential path, but kind of diverted him from the path that I was following. Then he had to work his way back into the story. So I've probably gone on too long, but you've been a good audience. I hope rather patient, and I'll answer whatever questions, quarrel, observations, trivializations you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. It's David Forte. Nice to see you.
Hi, David. Oh, yeah, great to see you.
you focused on this moment when Dickinson gives this moderate speech in the early Second Congress, and the other moderates jump down his throat. I didn't get an explanation about why they jumped down his throat, so I've got a couple of questions. A number of other founders, sometimes because of their own vanity, like John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, found him off-putting. He was a marvelous draftsman about making an argument. Was he not a skillful politician in the advocacy one-to-one? Did he fail in creating alliances, personal alliances, where people would respect you? I mean, that people would jump down at him for saying something they believed. There's something off-putting about that, and I haven't figured out why.
Yeah, David, that's a great question. I can't fully answer, but I have a couple ideas. So one thing Dickinson did, he did this in 1775, and he did it again in 1787. He tries to enhance his political position within Congress by getting instructions from his constituents that will limit his political behavior in the way he wants it to be limited. In 1775, and I'm forgetting the exact substance, but there are, I think, instructions of the Pennsylvania Assembly, which he says, and Jane, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure it's right, which were meant to kind of constrain his behavior in one sense. 1787, he and George Read get together. You know, George Read is a framer from Delaware, and they get the Delaware legislature to enact a resolution instructing them to insist upon the equal state vote in at least one house of Congress. And they read the instruction in the Federal Convention. The other delegates, as I read Madison's notes, basically laughed this off. Like, you can't impose, we're all here deliberating on the same project. Politically, you may think you're enhancing your position by kind of, invoking the authority of your supporters to kind of dictate something to you. But I think both in Philadelphia, across the street again, both in 75, late 75, whenever it was, early 76, and 87. I don't think this works. So I think that was Dickinson being politically artful, but not successful. And I guess, the way I write about the, Congress and Congress in general, but also the convention is you have to ask, not only what are the sources of division, or we might say factionalism, but what are the effective sources that are going to work towards consensus? And I think that attempt to appeal, in a sense, to appeal out of doors, I'm not using that term quite as I use it in other places, didn't work. On the personal side, I'm just not so sure. I mean, he has the famous blow-up with John Adams. I mean, I think John Adams, of course, is coming from a different position than John Rutledge in 1775. I mean, Adams has this captured letter where he refers to Dickinson as a certain great fortune of piddling genius. And, the British capture the letter and publicize it, and Adams is deeply embarrassed, and Dickinson won't talk to him, and they cross to opposite sides of the street when they're, when they're on the way to the Reading Market for a pastrami sandwich or whatever, which is where I spend the mid-afternoon. I told my wife I was going to work this into my remarks one way or the other. I stopped at Heshy's, is that the deli place there? So there's also, I think, but there's the famous moment, which I think to me is revealing, which I think it runs differently, where Dickinson takes Madison aside pretty early in the convention and says, look, I'm willing to go along with you substantively on most of the things you're proposing, but we got to have the equal state vote. Which, of course, Madison is dead set against. No, that's not a John Adams-like moment. I don't have any sense of Madison reacting against Dickinson in that way. I mean, of course, Adams had his own ego problems of a non-trivial nature, which I think is one. Talking about the Big Six, that's what that's one of the things that makes Adams so interesting. So he can't contain himself. He just can't stop. I mean, his relations with Franklin. I wrote about this in my book Revolutionaries. Franklin's line that he's a great patriot, but in some moments completely out of his senses, was based on some good empirical observation of a certain kind. So it's a good question. I mean, but Dickinson was a real political force, and maybe you could explain a lot of that. Maybe the celebrity gets, but from the farmers' letters. But I don't think that's it. I mean, I think Dickinson had a powerful intellect. Was well trained, was well educated, was a very successful attorney. as Adams was in Massachusetts, as Hamilton certainly was in New York. I mean, I think that counted for a lot. Political judgment, I'm just not so sure. I mean, but I do, my reading of Dean, and again, Dean it's an elliptical source, but quite, extraordinarily revealing in its way. My reading of Dean is he was, for some reason, he was just rubbing the people who should have been his natural allies, if not the wrong way, but, they weren't in agreement with him. So I think, Dickinson's conscience or whatever, or calculations were driving him to act in that way. It's the best I could do.
Jack, I actually have a question on the Dean source. You mentioned, if I remember correctly, after Dickinson gives his speech, James Wilson answers him as Dean writes it, which to me sounds like rebuts him. And Wilson and Dickinson are often not seen as opposed. So do you have any idea what Wilson said in response? And then
No, one of the things about this is, Congress is very quiet about this. I mean, in my first book, as you know, I spent a lot of time in their papers. And this was before most of the letters of delegates to Congress was out. I mean, just like I did my book on the Constitution before the documentaries of the ratification got very far. It's amazing I've done as well as I have, given, that in some ways I've been ahead of the editors, but, they're slow working. I just don't know. I mean, I do think, my mentor, Bud Balin, has that really interesting afterword and ideological origins to his chapter on conspiracy, where he talks about the earnestness. I mean, Wilson writes this, and I'm forgetting, maybe Bill remembers better, but Wilson writes this document in early 1776, which is an attempt to kind of account for the good faith motives of, the moderate group of which he was a part. So I think it goes back to the point I'm making. These guys are all, of course, conscience is a term we can use and abuse, but I think they are all acting on morally conscientious grounds. That's to say, they know they're making a decision that's enormously risky with potentially enormous losses, including the loss of life, and they're earnest about it. But I think most of the moderates say, by May, June, no, let's say by early June, when the Virginians when Richard Henry Lee presents the resolutions, I think they pretty well made up their minds. And they're still a little worried about public opinion. They want to make sure that New York joins in and all that, a couple of technical little glitches. Dickinson is still agonizing in a way, and since, he doesn't overcome it, B, when he's reviewing his notes for a last speech, I just find it to be, it's not our job to judge, but it seems to be kind of a weak document. It's analytically, it's just, or not rhetorically analytically, it didn't look to me to have been a strong speech. I mean, I think the one he came, when he had an hour to spend on his theories of reconciliation back in May 1775, I think he'd worked that out pretty well. And there are a few Dickinson letters from the period between when the first Congress adjourns and the second Congress convenes, where Dickinson is reflecting on, the state of colonial mind. So I think he was thinking creatively and actively about where to go, but somehow I think he went off on his own path in a sense.
So I don't think it will surprise anybody, least of all Jack, that I take issue with a few points of his interpretation of Dickinson. So I don't want to keep us too late. We have to go to dinner, so I can't address everything. But I'll just say, let's not forget that when Dickinson made these resolutions in the Second Continental Congress, there's no doubt that he angered people. There's no doubt that he was diminishing his celebrity. But they voted and they passed his resolutions, two of them unanimously. And even John Adams, who later claimed to be against the petition, the Olive Branch petition, voted for it. And it wasn't until after Congress adjourned that Adams wrote that infamous letter where he called Dickinson a piddling genius. And the result was that Dickinson's popularity within Congress was still such that they alienated Adams. They kind of rallied behind Dickinson and alienated Adams. And then, and I think, though, over those 6 months, sort of until just like the eve before the publication of Common Sense, I think the sentiment in Congress certainly shifted and towards independence, but not the general public. And when Dickinson said in early 1776, he said, the sentiment of the public is still for reconciliation. And then Jack's mistaken. Dickinson did not give up his political power. He did not give up his place in Congress. He was furious that when he was on the front fighting the British with his unit, he was ousted. What he was happy about was giving up his popularity, his celebrity. He said he was grateful to be done with that. So as soon as he got back from the front, he went right back into the Pennsylvania Assembly. And the reason he left was because the British were descending on Philadelphia, and he had to move his family out. So he then joined the militia, and went back to fight the British. And he was out for only a year before he went right back into Congress. And then he was out for only a year again, and then we went to the other offices he held. So, I think, yes, he was agonizing, and yes, he gave up his popularity, but, I don't think it wasn't sort of as maybe, you said that July 1776 independence was not inevitable, and I think Dickinson was highly tuned into the segments of the population that did not want independence. And in Pennsylvania, that was a sizable, if it was a minority, it was a sizable minority. So, I think that, it's sort of easy to read the anger in Congress and the fact that we know that how things turned out, to see Dickinson as this sort of, quixotic figure, but he knew what he was doing. In the Olive Branch petition, he knew that wasn't going to pass or not going to do anything. It was legal cover. It was not just like a last-ditch effort. It was a last-ditch effort, but it was legal cover. And he also drafted the Declaration on Taking Up Arms. And those portions of that declaration that were fiery and belligerent. And so, I think he knew what was going on, and he was trying his best and knew he was failing, which is why, he was ready to join his militia and go to New Jersey to fight the British. So Jack and I will argue about it, and we'll have fun with it. So with that, I will turn it back over.
Yeah, this is exactly where we're meeting to have more discussion and debate over Dickinson and his legacy. So thank you, Jack, and thank you, Jane, for your comments as well. And I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to continue the conversation. Thank you, Jack.